Who listening has flown into the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport? If so, you're in good company. This busy superhub has 73 million airline customers pass through each year. Like its own city, the airport's 5 terminals and 171 gates cover 26.9 square miles. It has its own zip code, city designation, police force, and emergency first responders, making it the 3rd busiest airport worldwide. I would guess that most people find some part of the flying process stressful, whether it's getting through security, finding your gate, timing out your arrival, or being on the plane itself. For me personally, I check to make sure I haven't lost my passport every 5 minutes, and at 5'0", I always worry that I won't be able to get my carry-on in the overhead bin easily. All of these things are amplified, though, for people who may need some additional support, such as those who are elderly or have a disability. Airports are equipped with passenger assistance programs that are designed to help fill the gap in scenarios where someone may need physical support to get to where they need to go. Oftentimes, this goes smoothly and the person is on their way to their destination. But sometimes it doesn't. In late 2001, a woman who had Alzheimer's disease was at DFW for a connecting flight home, but she didn't make it to her gate. A casual approach to the early search effort would prove deadly, but not for the reasons people expected. What seemed for years to be negligence that resulted in a terrible accident was turned upside down when this same woman was found deceased, and her cause of death was not dehydration or exposure to the elements from wandering off, but murder. This is A Simpler Time True Crime. The Murder of Marjorie Dabney. Joe Dabney Sr. and his wife Marjorie were happily married for 34 years. Marjorie had been married previously and had 8 children of her own when she married Joe. Once they were married, the couple added 2 more children. Joe had recently retired after working as a taxicab driver and construction worker. While Joe and Margie resided in Bakersfield, California, their 10 children scattered about the country, making their own routes. As Joe and Margie began to age, this part got a little complicated, as it does for many families. Joe had been in a traffic accident that caused him permanent injuries. By late 2001, he was using a wheelchair and was awaiting hip surgery. He was 63 years old and Margie was 70. In the short years leading up to this, Margie had developed Alzheimer's disease. You've probably heard of Alzheimer's disease, but here's a little more information about it. Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. Dementia is the overarching term for symptoms that affect cognitive abilities, memory, thinking, and behavior. Alzheimer's makes up 60 to 80% of dementia cases and is characterized by memory loss and cognitive decline. There are currently around 7 million people in the United States with Alzheimer's disease, and that number is expected to grow. While there are treatments and therapies to manage parts of Alzheimer's, there is no cure. Another major symptom of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia is wandering off and becoming disoriented. Because Alzheimer's impacts the ability to recognize familiar faces, people who have it can have difficulty orienting themselves to a space. So they may be out in public and wander off searching for someplace familiar. Some individuals also wander due to a sense of restlessness. They have no real place to go and they have no sense of where they're going. They just feel the need to move. People with Alzheimer's can mistake living in a different time in their life. They search for a sense of self they recognize, so they'll wander off to fulfill a previous obligation, like going to work. They will also sometimes be in search of a relative, dead or alive. They may say they want to go home, even if they're safely in their homes. According to the Alzheimer's Association, 60% of people with all forms of dementia will wander off at least once, and many do so repeatedly. It can also happen at any stage of the disease. Margie was part of this statistic. At just 95 pounds, Margie was still a force to be reckoned with, but Alzheimer's had already begun to rob her of so much, and she was suffering from a significant progression of the disease. One of the Dabney's children, Candace Price, described Margie as close to her father. She said, quote, "My mother would never walk away. She was too clingy to my daddy." End quote. It's clear that Margie felt deep comfort in the presence of Joe, but unfortunately, the complexity of her disease still did lead her to wander. This was becoming taxing for Joe and his family members, particularly because of his own frail health and limited mobility to keep her safe. One strategy he would use is to have Margie push his wheelchair. He felt this would help her to feel safe by his side, give her a sense of resolve and purpose, and also allow him to know of her whereabouts at all times. He felt that as long as they were both together, they would figure things out and be okay. Margie had once been lost in Bakersfield, California for 3 days after wandering off from a Greyhound bus terminal while Joe was using the restroom. Margie also had a pattern of seeking out hospitals. When she would show up, she would ask to see her husband Joe or to see her mother, who had passed away a year prior in the year 2000. In late November of 2001, Joe Dabney was scheduled for hip surgery in Bakersfield. He was lacking natural supports in the area and knew that he needed someone to care for Margie while he was recovering from his surgery. So he flew Margie out to Indianapolis to be with one of their daughters. Now, I want to note that most articles you read about Margie's case will discuss Joe being in a wheelchair due to recent hip surgery and him recovering from recent hip surgery. But Joe himself told the New York Times that, in actuality, he had to abandon having his hip surgery because Margie was having a hard time out in Indianapolis. Likely struggling with being in an unfamiliar place and out of her routine, Margie was repeatedly trying to wander. Her daughter was doing her absolute best to keep her safe, but felt in over her head. She had to work sometimes, and she felt she couldn't leave the house to work or even to get groceries without padlocking her mom in a room. Joe wasn't comfortable with this, and he knew he needed to help his daughter out and his wife, so he made the decision to fly back to Indianapolis to pick up his wife and bring her back home with him. Joe utilized traveler assistance programs often to support him in his travels. When he booked the December 5th American Airlines flight home, he prearranged for airline personnel to assist both him and his wife to get to their gates on the plane. The plan was to fly out of Indianapolis, have a short layover in Dallas-Fort Worth, and then fly into Los Angeles to head back to Bakersfield. As they prepared to fly out of Indianapolis, Joe checked in and made them aware of the needs he and his wife had, and they were given identifiers as passengers needing assistance. His daughter had also already alerted the airlines of this. Margie wore a lanyard with a tag stating she had Alzheimer's disease. She was also wearing comfortable black pants that day and a dark multicolored sweater, along with a faux leather black jacket over the top of it. Just a quick note, it's obviously not the best feeling from a dignity and inclusivity standpoint to have your personal information just out there in such a visible manner in order to get the right supports, but in this case, when balancing dignity with risk and safety, I can understand this being a really important thing to do. For unknown reasons, American Airlines labeled 70-year-old Margie as an unaccompanied minor. I don't know if this was a true error or if there was no category that fit a wandering person with Alzheimer's, so they just decided to label her what they believed the support she would need, which was similar to that of a small child. The first leg of the flight from Indy to DFW was accomplished, but not without a hitch. Margie was agitated during the flight and at one point got out of her seat and tried to open a door on the plane. Joe was able to work with flight attendants to get her back seated and able to make it to DFW safely. Everything from this point on is disputed depending on who you talk to. There's the story that American Airlines reps share, the story that DFW reps share, and the story that Joe Dabney Sr. shares. I'm going to do my best to share the different perspectives because there are so many possibilities and so many questions left unanswered. I think the benefit of sharing all information there is can help generate conversation and ideas, but ultimately, there is only one truth, and I don't know that we will ever find it. I'm hopeful we will, which is why I'm talking about this case. The one piece that all parties agree on is that after the flight landed in DFW, Margie Dabney was at some point left unattended after getting off at gate 35, and she wandered off without getting to her connecting gate, 39. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening to this week's episode. I research, record, edit, and promote this podcast as a one-woman show, in addition to my full-time job. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please share this podcast with friends, family, and on social media platforms so that I can reach more people about these cold cases. You can also follow me on Instagram at Simpler Time Crime Pod and the newly formed Facebook page, A Simpler Time True Crime. Now, back to the show. According to Joe Dabney Sr., he never saw his wife after getting off the plane. You'll recall, Margie usually pushes Joe in his wheelchair. He said he was looking for that, but American Airlines wheeled him from the jetway. He said the rep didn't speak very much English, and Joe was having difficulty conveying his needs and concerns to this person. Joe said he kept saying, "Where is my wife? Where is my wife?" And the person seemed to initially be ignoring him, but then said, "She went to the bathroom." Joe panicked and said, "You let her go to the bathroom by herself? She has Alzheimer's." Joe attests that he and his wife were supposed to both have AIDS for this stretch. Joe said the attendant did not respond to his concerns, and he told him to stop the wheelchair. The attendant allegedly did not, so Joe tried to apply his wheelchair brake. When this didn't work and the attendant still didn't stop, Joe took one of the wheelchair's footrests and hit the attendant with it. At this point, the airport attendant called airport security, who threatened to arrest Joe for assault. Joe said he was so desperate at this point to just get them to take his concerns seriously. At this juncture, they did recognize that Mrs. Dabney was not where she was supposed to be, but they assured Joe that they would find her no problem and that he needed to get on his connecting flight or he would be arrested. Joe stated that against his wishes, they forced him on to the next flight. He told CNN, quote, "When I told him she was going, they just kept pushing me away, and I asked them, please give my wife help," end quote. Joe knew how serious finding his wife was because, in addition to having Alzheimer's, she also was diabetic and had high blood pressure. He knew without her life-saving medications, she couldn't survive for very long. I can only imagine how helpless Joe felt getting on that plane without the physical ability to stay back and just desperately wanting to help search for his wife. It's honestly heartbreaking. So that's what happened. Joe Dabney was wheeled onto a plane without his wife. The passenger sitting next to him conveyed her observations that corroborated Joe's story. According to an old interview transcript on people.bakersfield.com, the passenger named Renee said the following: "I first laid eyes upon Joe in the terminal in Dallas. Most everyone already had their boarding passes, and Joe came in on the scene late, visibly and verbally upset about something. I boarded the plane and sat in a window seat. The plane was full. The seat next to me was empty. Here came Joe down the aisle. He was disabled and barely could walk. He used left and right aisle seat shoulder rests as handrails. No doubt, Joe sat down next to me. Joe started to share his story with me. He had lost his wife, Margie. He told me that they both went into the restroom. He went into the men's room while she went into the women's room. When he came out, he waited for her, but she never came. Joe didn't have any money. He had no food and had not eaten all day. He asked American Airlines for help, but they just put him on his flight and sent him home. They should have taken action. For her sake, the airline should have kept Joe behind to help in the search. Joe explained Margie had Alzheimer's and couldn't remember her identity and home address and the basics, so if she wasn't found soon, she was gone for good. What I regretted most for years was never taking any real action. I should have gotten off the plane with Joe right then and there and helped him search for Margie. I should have stood up for him. I should have given him money. I should have told the airlines that this man was being mistreated. But no, I did nothing more than lend him my ear. How many times have I had to mentally drive the highways of Dallas wondering where she was? Too many." End quote. I just want to take a moment to say that this interview was conducted several years after Margie's disappearance, and there's pieces of this woman's statement that have some overlap with kind of the very public statements that American Airlines put out, so I'm not sure if maybe just what she's saying is completely what Joe reiterated to her, or if pieces of it sort of blended together over time, but I just thought that was worth noting. American Airlines and the airport have a different account of what went down. According to Andrea Rader, the spokesperson for American Airlines at the time, she said one attendant met both Dabneys at the jetway and that Margie was right by their side. According to her, one or both Dabneys needed to use the restroom. Rader said that while Margie was still wearing the tag indicating she needed assistance, it was tucked into her jacket and not visible. Rader said that Margie seemed, quote, lucid, and that it was possible the airline attendant in this instance thought that only Joe Dabney needed assistance. Said Rader, quote, she seemed fine. She didn't show any indication she needed special services, end quote. Many things about this statement give me pause. How do you know she was still wearing the tag if it was so obscured by her jacket? If you know that much, wouldn't you know that she was wearing the tag and therefore needed help? So which is it? And how does your airline get away with saying she seemed to have no need for assistance when in the flight just prior she tried to open a door on the plane? At best, your flight attendants failed to communicate Mrs. Dabney's needs, and at worst, you're lying to cover your butts. Mrs. Rader continued that Margie was supposed to meet them outside of the restrooms or at gate 39. She couldn't be sure which. Again, how are you the spokesperson and you don't even have the basic facts solidified? The attendant assigned to the Dabneys was a man, so when Margie didn't show up, the attendant asked a female to go in the restroom to look for Margie, but she wasn't in there. Mrs. Rader says that only then Mr. Dabney mentioned his wife had Alzheimer's. She continued on to say that Joe was put on the flight home because he wanted to be put on it, and that he told several airline employees mid-flight that his wife went missing all the time and was always found. She said, quote, "It came to be time to say, look, there's not much more we can do for you here, Mr. Dabney." Mr. Dabney became agitated with that, end quote. Yeah, I would too, Andrea. Mrs. Rader said that American Airlines independently searched for Margie for 45 minutes, doing searches gate by gate. When they didn't find her, that's when they called police to look for her. As a reminder, the police force is specific to this airport. A man named Ken Capps was the spokesperson for the airport. The airport is also pretty cagey in answering any questions to publications and reporters about Margie's disappearance. What they do is provide their timeline of search efforts exhausted to find Margie, which they copy and paste into an email to any media inquiries. According to the New York Times article that I have listed in the show notes, the timeline looks like this. On December 6th, the airport personnel began searching. Reached by phone, Mr. Capps said that this was an error and that actually the search began on December 5th, the day Mrs. Dabney was lost. According to that same article, Miss Rader of American Airlines said tracking dogs were used to search for Mrs. Dabney on December 9th after someone called in response to the publicity, which began on December 7th. The airport's email messages suggest that the use of dogs began immediately and continued for several days. Both say that the dogs followed Mrs. Dabney's scent along a service road, but that suddenly the scent vanished, suggesting that she entered a car at that point. You also heard that correct too. The general public did not find out about Margie being missing until December 7th, 2 full days after her disappearance. According to Alzheimer's advocates, the first misstep of those searching was thinking that they could internally find Margie on their own. Brian Hance of the Alzheimer's Association's Safe Return program states that when a person with Alzheimer's goes missing, the first 2 hours are absolutely crucial. Oftentimes people are found within 1.5 miles of where they were last seen, but time is of the essence. If not found within 24 hours, 46% of people with Alzheimer's will die from hypothermia, dehydration, or another medical concern. That statistic gets worse and worse as time passes. The Dabney's daughter, Candace Price, flew down to Dallas to help search for her mother. She'd later describe how she didn't pay her car note that month to be able to afford her ticket down to help look for her. American Airlines went on to say that they offered Mr. Dabney and their children complimentary flights back to Dallas to help look for Margie, which, in my opinion, is the least they could do. A long-haul truck driver, Candace tried to get jobs down in Dallas to keep searching for her mother. Her and her husband talked it over, and she continued to extend her stay down there because she just couldn't bear the thought of leaving without finding her. The search went on for Margie. The DFW airport is 18,000 acres, and airport personnel searched all over. Around the city, psych wards were checked, churches, truck stops, and even morgues. A group of activists who do monthly homeless checks circulated over 5,000 flyers. But with all that effort, there are some oddities around all of this. According to Bruce South, a lawyer representing Joe Dabney, 2 pilots came forward saying they saw Mrs. Dabney in a secured area outside of the terminal, twice on December 5th and again on December 7th. South said, quote, "We know at least 2 days she probably wandered around some secured area of the airport, and after that last sighting on December 7th, there's been no trace of Margie Dabney," end quote. As I read this, I wondered how a 90-pound elderly woman in frail health could go undetected in a secured part of the airport for this amount of time. Another thought I had was that this was about 12 weeks out from 9/11, the event that changed air travel as we know it forever. How is security so lax then? Wouldn't security in the world's 3rd busiest airport be at an all-time high at this point? The timing of this event in relation to 9/11 may have less to do with this case than first thought, though. Sure, some things changed immediately after 9/11, but I looked it up, and the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, which gave way to establishing the TSA, was not passed until November 19, 2001, just 16 days before Margie's disappearance. So many of the streamlined security measures wouldn't have been put into practice yet, as they were still in the stage of developing policy. Still, some parts of it just don't add up. While a lot of cases I cover were pre-surveillance camera days, 2001 was entirely still possible to have surveillance, particularly in a giant airport. And security footage has been another topic that official personnel really try to avoid talking about. Some sources state that there was no video footage found of Margie Dabney, or Joe for that matter. A secondary airport spokesperson named David Magana refused to answer if video surveillance was used in the airport or its terminals, which is odd because if there wasn't, it would be really easy to just say that and clear it up. American Airlines hired their own private investigator to search for Margie. While it seems well-intentioned at face value, I have a hard time moving past the conflict of interest. Would an investigator hired by the airlines be very motivated to share information with the public if that information painted the airlines in anything but a positive light? This, alongside many frustrations and desperation to find his wife, caused Joe Dabney to hire Bruce South and sue American Airlines for upwards of $75 million in 2002. The case was settled for an undisclosed amount in 2003, but here are some of the details. The suit was filed in Bakersfield, where Margie lived at the time, and accuses American Airlines of gross negligence, breach of contract, and incompetence. American Airlines and the airport said very little publicly about the lawsuit, but both sides seemed to point the finger at the other. Ken Capps spoke for the airport saying, quote, "I do want the airlines to speak about the airlines, but what happened on the handoff between the airplane and the gate agent is the critical point. What I have said several times is that the airport did not lose Mrs. Dabney, but the airport has tried valiantly to find her. We feel quite comfortable in our efforts in this case," end quote. He also added that the airport would be undergoing training from the local chapter of the Alzheimer's Association on what to do if somebody went missing. American Airlines rep Andrea Rader reiterated all the steps the airlines had taken to locate Margie Dabney, but when asked about responsibility in her disappearance, she said, quote, "That's a tough question to answer because there's a lot of nuances to it and a lot of things we just don't know at this stage of things. Our actions certainly say that this was a terrible thing that happened to one of our customers, that we really pulled out all the stops," end quote. In filing the lawsuit, Joe Dabney Sr. simply stated, "I would like to just find my wife, and I pray I find her. I know I ain't got long to be here, but I pray and trust I see her before I go," end quote. In a heartbreaking detail, nearly 3 months after his wife had vanished, he was interviewed in his Bakersfield cottage-style home. He pointed to a box of Christmas decorations he couldn't put up, and then over to his unpacked suitcases. He said he couldn't bear to unpack them because his wife had been the last one to close them up on the morning of her disappearance. After the lawsuit wrapped up in 2003, nothing really happened for years. There was missing flyers out for Margie, but it wasn't an active investigation. The consensus was that negligence led to Margie wandering off, which tragically led to her demise when she wasn't able to get the ongoing care and medications that she needed. Tragically, Margie's remains were just out there somewhere. But everyone was in for a shock when a 2007 discovery would convey a whole new story. On November 26, 2007, nearly 6 years after Margie's disappearance, Louisville police were sent to an area below the Louisville Lake Dam, 14 miles north of DFW, for reports of the location of a human skull. 2 weeks prior, there had been a controlled burn in the area, which now revealed the skull and other human remains. These bones were sent off to the medical examiner's office, but there was no sense of who this was. However, the following October of 2008, during another controlled burn in the area, belongings of Margie Dabney were found. This included her AARP card, clothes matching the description of what she was last wearing, her airlines tag, and her bus pass. This prompted authorities to reach out to Margie's family for items to compare for DNA analysis. Candace Price recalled saying, quote, "We really had to sit down and say, what if this is Mama?" End quote. She began preparing herself for the bad news, but she thought that maybe her diabetic mother just died peacefully in her sleep. After DNA analysis, the remains were positively identified as those of Marjorie Dabney. But that wasn't all. The medical examiner dropped a bombshell to the family. Margie had died conclusively from blunt force trauma to her head, either by gunshot or being hit by a hard object. Joe, Candace, and the rest of the family were devastated and confused. Who would murder a sweet elderly woman who had been such a kind soul on this earth, and why? They had always held out hope that somebody was just caring for Margie somewhere, but now she was gone, and the worst-case scenario had happened to her. Louisville police had the unique task of having to start a whole different type of investigation from scratch. Joni Eddy, the Louisville Police Department assistant police chief at the time, said, quote, "Certainly it's going to be an uphill battle. Now is the point we really gear up and hopefully develop some leads," end quote. The medical examiner could not determine if Marjorie died at the location or if her body was placed there after. I personally wondered about the clothing being found later after her remains were found. Were her clothes taken off her at some point during the act of the murder? Were her bones just scattered later by animals? Did somebody abduct her from the airport property, or did she, in a confused state, tell people she wanted to go to a hospital, like she often did, and then someone harmed her in the second location? Was somebody attempting to rob her? Did someone associated with the airport or airlines attempt to cover up negligence? Did a person randomly looking for a thrill kill shoot her? Was it sexually motivated, and she was just a target because she was vulnerable? All of these questions and theories associated with them are all speculative, because that's all there is to do in this case. There has never been a single person of interest named, and no substantial theory as to how Margie got 17 miles northeast of the airport, dead in a remote field. Captain Kevin Deaver tried hard to come up with leads after her body was found. He tried to get her featured on America's Most Wanted, but I couldn't find any episode she was on. If you know one way or another if she was featured, send me a message. Captain Deaver said she was not on any videos he received from the airport, which again to me would confirm that the airport videos did exist, so it's confusing and convenient to me that she isn't on any. Captain Deaver did mention the tarmac sightings, but said that airport investigators could never substantiate those claims. The Louisville Police Department says her last known sighting was on an airport service road at 1800 North Service Road on December 7th, 2 days after her disappearance. Louisville police reviewed the whole airport investigation as well as the toll gate records that recorded the license plates of vehicles that arrived and left the airport. But Captain Deaver mentioned that those records were in what he described as rough shape. Investigators tried to go to area businesses that may have had surveillance, but of course those had long been destroyed and written over. They also attempted to go through records of any suspicious activity in the Louisville area around the time of Margie's disappearance, but they couldn't make any connections. And that's where the case stands to this day. I wanted to take a moment to share some resources for families who have a loved one with Alzheimer's, and so that anybody who is listening might feel better prepared to help if encountering an Alzheimer's-related emergency. Some tips that the Alzheimer's Association has for people living with someone with Alzheimer's are the following. Use nightlights in the home. Cover doorknobs with cloth the same color as the door or use safety covers. Camouflage doors by painting them the same color as the walls or covering them with removable curtains or screens. Use black tape or paint to create a 2-foot black threshold in front of the door. It may act as a visual stop barrier. Install warning bells above doors or use a monitoring device that signals when a door is opened. Place a pressure-sensitive mat in front of the door or at the person's bedside to alert you to movement. Put hedges or a fence around the patio, yard, or other outside common areas. Use safety gates or brightly colored netting to prevent access to stairs or the outdoors. Monitor noise levels to help reduce excessive stimulation. Create indoor and outdoor common areas that can be safely explored. Label all doors with signs or symbols to explain the purpose of each room. Store items that may trigger a person's instinct to leave, such as coats, hats, pocketbooks, keys, and wallets. And do not leave the person alone in the car. Other proactive measures you can take include enrolling the person with dementia in a wandering response service. You can ask neighbors, friends, and family to call if they see the person wandering lost or dressed inappropriately. Always keep a recent close-up photo of the person on hand to give to police, should the need ever arise. Know the person's neighborhood. Identify potentially dangerous areas near the home, such as bodies of water, open stairwells, dense foliage, tunnels, bus stops, and roads with heavy traffic. Create a list of places the person may wander to, such as their past jobs, old homes, or places of worship, or even a favorite restaurant. Finally, if a person with Alzheimer's does go missing, start search efforts immediately. When looking, consider whether the person is right or left-handed. Wandering patterns generally follow the direction of the dominant hand. Begin by looking in the surrounding vicinity because many individuals who wander are found within 1.5 miles of where they disappeared. Check local landscapes such as ponds, tree lines, or fence lines. Many individuals are found within brush or briar. If a person has wandered in the past, search areas where they've been found. Most importantly, if the person is not found within 15 minutes, call 911 to file a missing persons report and inform the authorities that the person has dementia. If you need any assistance with someone you love having Alzheimer's, there is a 24/7 hotline at 1-800-272-3900. People with Alzheimer's typically live 3 to 11 years after diagnosis. Given the advanced stages of Margie's condition, she would likely not be alive today. But the way Margie died is a terrible injustice. Margie deserved to live out her natural life in dignity with her loved ones, especially her beloved husband Joe, by her side. Instead, she was violently taken from this world, and nobody has had to answer for it. If you know anything about the disappearance and murder of Marjorie Dabney, please contact the Louisville Police Department at 972-219-3640 or the Louisville Police Department Crime Tip Line at 972-219-8477. If you appreciate the efforts being done to amplify unsolved cases on this show, please follow along on Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod or follow the new A Simpler Time True Crime Facebook page. Follow the podcast on your preferred listening platform so you know when new episodes are released. Leaving 5-star reviews and sharing the podcast with friends and family helps me get the word out about these cold cases, and I couldn't do it without you. Thank you for listening.